I'm Rachel Bennett, 28 years old, and for the last 2 years of my life, I watched my beloved grandmother Dorothy fade away while I held her hand through every doctor's appointment, every sleepless night, and every moment of pain. I gave up my apartment, my social life, and what little savings I had from working double shifts at Bridgetown Brew, just to make sure she wouldn't die alone in some sterile nursing facility. When Grandma finally passed in January, I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong. My brother's wife Vanessa decided that the beautiful Victorian house my grandmother left me in her will should belong to them instead. And she launched a calculated campaign to turn my entire family against me. She painted me as a manipulative gold digger who tricked a dying old woman, and one by one, my relatives started looking at me like I was a stranger. My own brother stopped returning my calls. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My parents questioned whether I'd really cared about Grandma or just wanted her money. Family dinners became interrogations. I lost everything that mattered, my family's trust, my reputation, the memory of the woman who raised me when my parents were too busy. I was completely alone, drowning in grief and betrayal, with no way to prove my innocence. Then something impossible started happening in that old Victorian house. Doors opened on their own. The scent of Grandma's roses filled rooms in the dead of winter. Her vintage piano played melodies in the middle of the night when nobody was there. And Vanessa, who'd been so confident in her lies, started experiencing things that made her question everything. What happened next didn't just clear my name. It exposed truths that shattered my family's perception of reality itself. Looking back now, I can see how perfectly Grandma and I fit together, like two puzzle pieces that nobody else understood. Every Sunday since I was 6 years old, I'd ride my bike to her Victorian house in Laurelhurst, the one with the wraparound porch and stained glass windows that threw rainbow patterns across the hardwood floors when the afternoon sun hit just right. While other kids spent weekends at soccer practice or shopping malls, I spent mine learning how to prune her rose garden, listening to stories about her childhood in rural Oregon, and helping her organize the thousands of photographs she'd collected over 8 decades of life. My parents Robert and Linda had retired to Arizona 3 years earlier, chasing endless sunshine and golf courses, leaving Portland and its rain behind without much thought. My brother Kevin had always been the golden child, the one who went to Oregon State and landed a software engineering job at Intel right out of college, the one who made sensible choices and never caused worry. I was the one who dropped out of community college halfway through a veterinary tech program, because I couldn't handle the emotional weight of seeing animals suffer. I was the one who worked at a coffee shop at 28, living in a 400-square-foot studio on Division Street that cost $1,200 a month, and left me with barely enough for groceries after utilities. I was the one everyone worried about at family gatherings, the one who hadn't figured life out yet. But Grandma never made me feel like a failure. She'd sit across from me at her kitchen table, pouring Earl Grey into delicate china cups that had belonged to her own grandmother. And she'd tell me that success wasn't about job titles or bank accounts. It's about knowing who you are and staying true to it, she'd say, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup, her blue eyes still sharp despite her advancing age. You've got a good heart, Rachel. That matters more than any degree or career. When I'm gone, I want you to remember that you were enough exactly as you were. I never imagined those words would become so important, or that I'd cling to them like a lifeline when everyone else decided I wasn't enough at all. The first sign that Grandma was declining came in the spring of 2023. I showed up for our usual Sunday visit, and found her standing in her rose garden, staring at the bushes with pruning shears in her hand, looking confused and lost. "Rachel," she'd said, turning to me with tears in her eyes, "I can't remember which ones I've already trimmed. I've been out here for an hour, and I keep going in circles." My heart had cracked right then. Seeing this strong woman who'd buried a husband, raised 2 sons, and maintained her independence well into her 80s suddenly unable to perform the task she'd done every spring for 40 years. I'd gently taken the shears from her hands, guided her inside, and made an appointment with her doctor for the following week. The diagnosis came quickly. Vascular dementia, progressive and irreversible. She had maybe 2 to 3 years if we were lucky. The neurologist had been matter-of-fact about it, listing symptoms and stages like he was reading a grocery list, while I sat there trying not to cry and Grandma patted my hand like I was the one who needed comforting. My parents had flown up from Arizona for the appointment, their faces tight with concern that dissolved into relief when the doctor mentioned memory care facilities and professional caregivers. "We'll look into the best places," my father Robert had said in the parking lot afterward, already pulling up websites on his phone. "There's a nice one near the mall, very clean, good reviews." I'd looked at Grandma sitting in the passenger seat of my beat-up Honda Civic, staring out the window at the clouds rolling in from the west, and I'd made a decision right there. "She's not going into a facility," I'd said, my voice firmer than I'd felt. "I'll take care of her." My mother Linda had frowned, her sun-weathered face creasing with doubt. "Rachel, honey, that's a full-time commitment. You have your job, your life. We can hire professionals who know what they're doing." But I'd shaken my head, already knowing this was the right choice even if it was the hard one. "She took care of me my whole childhood when you guys were working. She never put me in daycare or shipped me off somewhere. I'm not doing that to her. I'll move in with her. I'll figure it out." Kevin had been there too, standing next to his Honda Accord with his arms crossed, and he'd nodded slowly. "If Rachel wants to do this, we should let her," he'd said. "I can help with expenses, medical bills, whatever you need." For a moment, I'd felt grateful for my brother's support, not knowing that 2 years later he'd be standing in a lawyer's office claiming I'd manipulated our dying grandmother for money. But that afternoon in the parking lot, we'd all been on the same page, or so I'd thought. Vanessa hadn't been there for that conversation. She never came to medical appointments or family discussions about Grandma's care. She was too busy with her own life, working as a real estate agent, and complaining about how exhausting it was to stage houses and deal with difficult clients. The few times I'd seen her before Grandma's diagnosis, she'd spent the entire visit on her phone, scrolling through property listings and barely acknowledging anyone else in the room. I moved into Grandma's Victorian house 3 days after that parking lot conversation, hauling my limited belongings up the stairs to the second-floor bedroom that had been mine during childhood sleepovers. The room still had the same floral wallpaper, the same creaky floorboards, the same window seat where I'd spent countless hours reading while rain pattered against the glass. It felt like coming home and saying goodbye at the same time. I gave up my studio apartment, telling my landlord I wouldn't be renewing the lease, and I rearranged my schedule at Bridgetown Brew to work only morning shifts, so I could be home with Grandma by early afternoon. My manager Marcus had been understanding, giving me the flexibility I needed even though it meant taking a pay cut from 30 hours a week down to 25. I made up the difference by pet-sitting through Rover, watching people's dogs and cats in the evenings when Grandma was settled in front of the television, or already asleep. It wasn't much, barely $16 an hour at the coffee shop and maybe $300 extra a month from pet-sitting, but it was enough to buy groceries and keep gas in my car. Those first few months weren't so bad. Grandma still recognized me every day, still remembered most of her stories, still laughed at our inside jokes. We fell into a comfortable routine. I'd wake up at 5 in the morning, make her breakfast of oatmeal with blueberries and honey, help her get dressed, and then head to work at Bridgetown Brew where I'd steam milk and pull espresso shots for cranky commuters until 1 in the afternoon. I'd rush home, usually grabbing a sandwich from the convenience store on the corner, and spend the rest of the day with Grandma. We'd work in her rose garden when the weather allowed, or sit in the living room organizing her massive collection of photographs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Or simply watch old movies on the classic film channel she loved. She'd point at the screen during Casablanca or Gone with the Wind, and tell me about seeing those movies in theaters when they were new releases, back when tickets cost $0.25 and popcorn came in paper bags. Those moments felt precious, like catching sunlight in my hands before it disappeared forever. Kevin visited maybe once a month during that first year, usually on a Saturday afternoon when it was convenient for him. He'd bring Vanessa along, and they'd stay for exactly 1 hour, making awkward small talk in the living room while Grandma smiled politely and tried to remember who Vanessa was. "That's Kevin's wife," I'd whisper to her after they'd introduced themselves for the 3rd or 4th time. And she'd nod like she understood, but I could see the confusion in her eyes. Vanessa would spend the entire visit checking her phone, occasionally making comments about how much the house would be worth if Grandma had ever decided to sell. "This neighborhood has really appreciated," she'd said once, walking around the living room like she was already staging it for an open house. "These original details, the crown molding, the hardwood floors, buyers would go crazy for this." Kevin had shot her a look that said not now, but Vanessa had just shrugged, unapologetic. "I'm just saying, it's a valuable property." It seemed like an innocent observation at the time. I didn't realize she was already calculating, already planning, already deciding that this house should belong to her. My parents called every Sunday evening, a scheduled phone call that lasted exactly 15 minutes. They'd ask how Grandma was doing, whether she was eating well, if there had been any incidents or concerning changes. I'd give them updates while standing in the kitchen, stirring pasta sauce or loading the dishwasher, keeping my voice upbeat even when I was exhausted. "She's doing fine," I'd say, not mentioning the nights when she woke up at 3 in the morning thinking it was breakfast time, or the afternoon when she'd gotten confused trying to use the microwave and nearly started a fire. They didn't need to know every difficult detail. They were living their retirement dream in Arizona, playing golf and attending community theater productions, and I didn't want them to feel guilty for not being here. Besides, I'd chosen this. I'd volunteered to be Grandma's caregiver, and I was determined to do it right, to give her the dignity and love she deserved in her final years. But as 2023 turned into 2024, things got harder. Grandma started having trouble recognizing faces, even mine sometimes. I'd walk into her bedroom in the morning, and she'd look at me with fear in her eyes, asking who I was and what I was doing in her house. "It's me, Rachel," I'd say gently, sitting on the edge of her bed and taking her hand. "Your granddaughter. I'm here to help you get ready for the day." Sometimes the fog would clear and she'd smile with relief, squeezing my hand and apologizing for forgetting. Other times the confusion would last for hours, and I'd have to coax her through every activity like she was a frightened child. Getting her to take her medications became a daily battle. She'd insist she'd already taken them, or claim I was trying to poison her, or simply refuse to swallow the pills no matter how much I explained they were helping her. I started crushing them into applesauce or pudding, feeling guilty for the deception but knowing it was necessary. The medical bills started piling up too. Medicare covered some things, but not everything, and Grandma's supplemental insurance had gaps that left me paying out of pocket for medications, specialist appointments, and medical equipment. I bought a shower chair after she fell getting out of the bathtub, bruising her hip badly enough that I'd panicked, and called an ambulance. The emergency room visit alone cost $800 after insurance. I installed grab bars in the bathroom, purchased incontinence supplies when she started having accidents, and paid for a medical alert system that she refused to wear because she said it made her feel old. My savings from my failed attempt at running a small pet-sitting business years ago, about $3,000 I'd carefully built up, started disappearing. $500 here for prescriptions, $300 there for a walker she needed after her balance got worse, $200 for the home health aide I hired to give me a break one afternoon a week, so I could go to my own doctor's appointment, or just sit in a coffee shop alone for 2 hours. Kevin had promised to help with expenses, but his contributions were sporadic and minimal. He'd Venmo me $200 every couple of months with a message saying sorry it's not more, work's been crazy, and I'd thank him even though $200 barely covered a week's worth of Grandma's medications. He never asked for receipts or details about where the money was going. He just sent what he felt like sending when he remembered, which wasn't often enough to make a real difference. Vanessa, meanwhile, had stopped coming to visit entirely. She'd send Kevin alone, claiming she had showings or open houses or client meetings that couldn't be rescheduled. I was relieved, honestly. Her presence had always felt invasive, like she was cataloging everything in the house and mentally calculating its resale value. Without her there, Kevin and I could have actual conversations, brother to sister, about how Grandma was doing and what to expect as her condition worsened. I'll never forget the morning everything shifted. The morning when exhaustion finally cracked through my determination and left me trembling in Grandma's kitchen with tears streaming down my face. It was a Tuesday in late October of 2024, one of those gray Portland mornings where the rain hadn't quite started, but the sky promised it would come soon. I'd been awake since 2 in the morning because Grandma Dot had gotten out of bed, convinced she needed to leave for a job she hadn't worked in 30 years. She'd been pulling clothes out of her closet, getting increasingly agitated when she couldn't find her work shoes, muttering about being late and getting fired. I'd spent an hour gently redirecting her, explaining that she was retired, that it was the middle of the night, that she needed to rest. Finally, around 3:30, she'd let me guide her back to bed, where she'd fallen asleep immediately while I'd lain awake in my own room, too wired with adrenaline to drift off again. When my alarm went off at 5, I'd dragged myself out of bed feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Every muscle ached. My eyes burned. My head pounded with the beginning of what I knew would become a migraine if I didn't catch it early. But there was no time for self-care, no time to lie down with a cold compress and wait for the pain to pass. I had to get Grandma Dot up, dressed, fed, and situated before I left for my shift at Bridgetown Brew. I stumbled into her room to find her already awake, sitting on the edge of her bed with a confused expression that made my heart sink. She didn't recognize me again. The fog had rolled back in overnight, erasing whatever clarity she'd had the previous day. "Who are you?" she'd asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "And what are you doing in my house?" I'd gone through the whole explanation again, patient and gentle despite my exhaustion, until she'd finally accepted that I was there to help her. Getting her dressed took 40 minutes because she kept insisting the clothes I'd picked out were wrong, that she needed something else, something she couldn't quite articulate but would know when she saw it. We went through half her closet before she settled on a floral blouse and elastic waist pants, the same outfit she'd worn 3 times that week. I helped her to the bathroom, waited outside the door in case she needed assistance, then guided her downstairs to the kitchen where I made her usual breakfast of oatmeal with blueberries. She picked at it, eating maybe 3 spoonfuls before pushing the bowl away and declaring she wasn't hungry. "You need to eat something," I'd urged, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "Your medications require food, remember?" But she'd shaken her head stubbornly, crossing her arms like a toddler refusing vegetables. I glanced at the clock. 6:15. I needed to leave for work in 10 minutes or I'd be late, and Marcus had already been accommodating enough with my schedule. I couldn't afford to push his patience any further. I'd compromised, making Grandma Dot a piece of toast with butter, and watching her take a few reluctant bites before crushing her morning medications into a small amount of applesauce. She'd swallowed it without protest this time, thankfully, and I'd settled her in her favorite armchair in the living room with the television remote and a blanket tucked around her legs. "I'll be back by 1:30, I'd told her, kneeling beside the chair so we were eye level. "There's juice in the refrigerator if you get thirsty, and you can call me if you need anything. My number's right here on this paper next to the phone." She'd nodded vaguely, already absorbed in whatever morning talk show was playing on the screen. Work had been brutal that day. We'd been understaffed because 2 baristas had called out sick, leaving just me and another coworker, Jasmine, to handle the morning rush. The line had stretched out the door from 7 to 11 without a break, a constant stream of impatient customers ordering complicated drinks, asking for modifications, complaining about wait times. My feet had throbbed in my non-slip shoes. My hands had cramped from operating the espresso machine for hours straight. A woman in business attire had snapped at me when her almond milk latte took 3 minutes longer than she'd expected, telling me she was going to be late for a meeting because I was incompetent. I'd apologized, forced a smile, and remade her drink even though there was nothing wrong with the first one, because that's what you do in customer service. You swallow your dignity and your exhaustion, and you smile. By the time my shift ended at 1, I'd been running on fumes. I'd grabbed a pre-made sandwich from the refrigerated case, not even bothering to heat it up, and eaten it in my car during the 15-minute drive back to Laurelhurst. I'd walked through Grandma Dot's front door expecting to find her still in her armchair, maybe napping or watching television. Instead, I'd found chaos. The kitchen faucet was running full blast, overflowing the sink and flooding the tile floor. Grandma Dot was standing in the middle of the water in her socks, looking bewildered and frightened, holding a kitchen towel like she'd been trying to mop up the mess but didn't know how. "Oh, Rachel," she'd said when she saw me, "thank goodness you're here. I don't know what happened. I was trying to get a glass of water, and then everything went wrong." I'd waded through the water, turned off the faucet, and grabbed every towel I could find to start soaking up the flood. 2 inches of water covered the entire kitchen floor, seeping into the baseboards and spreading toward the dining room. I'd worked frantically, my sandwich forgotten on the counter, throwing down towels and wringing them out in the sink, over and over, while Grandma stood frozen in the doorway asking if she'd done something wrong. "It's okay," I'd kept saying, even though it wasn't okay, even though I wanted to scream or cry or both. "It was an accident. These things happen. Let's get you into dry socks." I'd guided her to the living room, changed her socks, settled her back in her chair, then returned to the kitchen to continue the cleanup. It had taken 2 hours to get all the water up, to run 3 loads of soaking towels through the washing machine, to check the baseboards for damage, and set up fans to dry everything out. By the time I'd finished, it was almost 4 in the afternoon and I'd realized I hadn't eaten my sandwich, or had anything to drink since my shift started. My head was pounding, my vision spotting at the edges, my hands shaking with low blood sugar and exhaustion. I'd sat down at the kitchen table, finally dry, and that's when I'd let myself break down. The tears had come hard and fast, my shoulders shaking with sobs I couldn't control, all the stress and fatigue and loneliness pouring out in ugly, gasping cries. I'd buried my face in my arms on the table, trying to muffle the sounds so Grandma wouldn't hear and get upset, but I couldn't stop. I'd been doing this for 18 months, and I still had months or maybe years ahead of me, and I didn't know if I had the strength to keep going. That's when my phone had buzzed with a text message. I'd wiped my eyes, smearing tears across my cheeks, and looked at the screen. It was from Kevin. "Can we meet for coffee tomorrow? Vanessa and I want to talk to you about something important." My stomach had clenched with immediate anxiety. In my experience, nothing good ever came from conversations prefaced with "we need to talk." But I texted back sure, what time, and we'd arranged to meet at a cafe downtown at 10 in the morning, which meant I'd have to ask Marcus for another schedule adjustment, and find someone to stay with Grandma for a few hours. I'd closed my eyes, adding one more task to the endless list that never got shorter, and forced myself to stand up and start making dinner. The next morning, I dropped Grandma off at an adult day center I'd recently discovered. It was expensive, $75 for a half day, but it was the only option on short notice. The center offered activities and supervision for elderly adults, giving caregivers a break while ensuring their loved ones were safe and engaged. Grandma had been hesitant when I'd first mentioned it, insisting she didn't need a babysitter, but the staff had been warm and welcoming, and she'd eventually allowed herself to be led to a table where other seniors were working on a puzzle. I'd kissed her forehead, promised to pick her up by 2, and driven downtown with a knot of dread in my stomach. Kevin and Vanessa were already seated at a corner table when I arrived at the cafe, a trendy place with exposed brick walls and overpriced pastries. Vanessa looked polished as always, her blonde hair in a perfect bob, her makeup expertly applied, wearing a crisp white blouse and tailored pants that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. Kevin looked uncomfortable, his shoulders hunched, his fingers drumming on the table. I'd ordered a black coffee because it was the cheapest thing on the menu and joined them at the table, sliding into the chair across from them, and waiting for whatever bomb they were about to drop. Vanessa hadn't wasted time with pleasantries. "Rachel, we wanted to talk to you about Grandma's situation," she'd said, her tone businesslike, like we were discussing a real estate transaction instead of a human being. "Kevin and I have been talking, and we're concerned about the arrangement you have right now." I'd blinked, confused. "What arrangement?" "I'm taking care of her. That's what we all agreed on." Vanessa had leaned forward, folding her hands on the table. "Right, but it's not sustainable. You're burning yourself out, and honestly, we think Grandma would be better off in a professional facility where she can get round-the-clock care." My throat had tightened. "We've been over this. She doesn't want to go into a facility." I promised her she could stay in her own home. Kevin had finally spoken up, his voice apologetic but firm. "Rachel, nobody's questioning how much you care about Grandma. But Vanessa has a point. You've given up your apartment, your income is barely enough to survive, and you're exhausted all the time. This isn't healthy for you or for Grandma. There are really good memory care places around here. We've looked into a few. They have activities, medical staff on site, everything she needs." I'd felt anger rising in my chest, hot and sharp. She has everything she needs at home. She has me. Vanessa's expression had shifted, becoming harder. She has a house that's worth $850,000 in one of Portland's best neighborhoods, sitting there with nobody maintaining it properly because you're too overwhelmed to keep up with repairs and upkeep. That house is a family asset, Rachel. If something happens to it because of neglect, we all lose. There it was. The real concern. Not Grandma's well-being. Not my health. The house. The money. The inheritance that Vanessa had been calculating since the day Grandma's diagnosis came through. I'd stared at her, then at Kevin, seeing him clearly for the first time in months. He wouldn't meet my eyes. My voice had come out cold. This isn't about Grandma at all, is it? This is about you wanting access to that house. Vanessa had leaned back, crossing her arms. Don't be dramatic. We're thinking about what's best for everyone. A good facility would free you up to rebuild your own life, and the house could be sold or rented to cover Grandma's care costs. It's a practical solution. I'd stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. Grandma isn't going into a facility, and her house isn't being sold while she's still alive. I don't care what you think is practical. I made her a promise, and I'm keeping it. Kevin had reached out like he was going to grab my arm. Rachel, just listen. But I'd pulled away, grabbing my coffee and heading for the door. I'd heard Vanessa say something to Kevin as I left, her voice sharp with irritation, but I hadn't stayed to hear it. I'd sat in my car in the parking lot, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm down before I had to drive. They wanted to put Grandma away like she was an inconvenience, like she was a problem to be solved with the most efficient solution possible. And Vanessa, who'd never cared about Grandma, who'd never spent a single night helping with her care, was suddenly full of opinions about what was best. The rest of that week had been tense. Kevin had texted me several times, trying to smooth things over, saying they'd only been trying to help, and I was taking it the wrong way. I'd responded with short, clipped messages. I'm fine. Grandma's fine. Drop it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that a line had been drawn I hadn't known existed until I'd crossed it. Vanessa had shown her hand, and I had a sinking suspicion this wasn't the end of the conversation. She didn't strike me as someone who gave up easily, especially when money was involved. November arrived with heavy rains that turned the streets into rivers and made Grandma's rose garden a muddy mess. I'd stopped trying to maintain it, letting the bushes grow wild because I didn't have the time or energy to prune them properly. The house itself was starting to show signs of neglect too. There was a leak in the upstairs bathroom I couldn't afford to fix, so I'd put a bucket under it and emptied it twice a day. Several windows had broken seals, creating condensation between the panes that I couldn't do anything about. The furnace was making a strange rattling noise that probably meant it needed servicing, but a service call would cost at least $200 I didn't have. I was doing my best, but my best wasn't enough to keep a 100-year-old Victorian house in pristine condition, while also being a full-time caregiver. Grandma's condition continued to decline. She was having more bad days than good days now. More confusion than clarity. She'd started wandering at night, and I'd woken up twice to find her trying to leave the house in her nightgown, convinced she needed to go somewhere urgently. I'd installed extra locks on the doors, positioning them high where she couldn't reach, feeling guilty for essentially imprisoning her, but knowing it was necessary for her safety. She'd fallen once trying to go down the stairs too quickly, and I'd caught her just in time, my heart stopping as I'd grabbed the back of her sweater and steadied her against the railing. The close call had shaken me badly. I'd spent that entire night lying awake, imagining what would have happened if I'd been a second slower. My health was suffering too. I'd developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away, probably from stress and exhaustion weakening my immune system. I'd lost weight because I kept forgetting to eat proper meals, grabbing crackers or protein bars when I remembered food existed at all. My hair was falling out in the shower, coming away in clumps that clogged the drain. I had dark circles under my eyes that no amount of concealer could hide, and my hands trembled constantly from too much caffeine and too little sleep. Whitney, my best friend from high school, had started calling me every few days to check in, and her concern had grown more vocal as the months passed. "You sound terrible," she'd said bluntly during our last conversation. "When's the last time you saw a doctor?" I'd laughed, a hollow sound. When would I see a doctor, Whitney? I can barely find time to shower. She'd been quiet for a moment, then said, Rachel, you can't keep doing this. You're going to end up in the hospital yourself. But what was my alternative? Put Grandma in a facility like Kevin and Vanessa wanted. Breaking the promise I'd made to her? Hire full-time help I couldn't afford? Ask my parents to come back from Arizona and take over, disrupting their retirement? Every option felt impossible. So I kept going, dragging myself through each day, telling myself I just had to make it to the next hour, the next morning, the next week. Grandma had good moments still, brief windows of clarity when she'd look at me and really see me. When she'd squeeze my hand and say thank you for taking care of me, sweetheart. I know this isn't easy. Those moments were what kept me going, what made all the exhaustion and sacrifice feel worthwhile. Then, 3 weeks after that disastrous coffee meeting with Kevin and Vanessa, my phone rang while I was giving Grandma her evening medications. It was my mother Linda, calling from Arizona. Rachel, honey, we just got the strangest call from Vanessa, she'd said, her voice tentative. She told us some concerning things about how Grandma's house is falling apart, and how you're not coping well. She thinks we need to intervene. My blood had run cold. Intervene how? My mother had sighed. She suggested we look into getting a professional assessment of Grandma's care situation. Maybe bring in a social worker to evaluate whether the current arrangement is in Grandma's best interest. I'd felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Vanessa was going behind my back to my parents, planting seeds of doubt about my ability to care for Grandma. She was building a case against me, gathering allies, positioning herself as the voice of reason while painting me as incompetent. Mom, I'd said, trying to keep my voice steady, the house is fine. Grandma is fine. I'm handling everything. My mother had hesitated. Are you though, honey? Vanessa sent us some photos of the house. The bathroom leak, the windows, the overgrown garden. It doesn't look like things are being maintained properly. I'd closed my eyes, fury and helplessness warring in my chest. Of course things aren't perfect. I'm one person doing the work of 3 people on a barista's salary. But Grandma is clean, fed, medicated, and happy. That's what matters. But I could hear the doubt in my mother's voice when she'd responded. We just want to make sure everyone's okay, Rachel. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to have someone come take a look, just to give us all peace of mind. I'd ended the call shortly after that, my hands shaking with anger. Vanessa was conducting a campaign against me, methodically and strategically, and I hadn't even realized it was happening until the attack was already underway. She'd taken photos of the house's problems, contacted my parents, positioned herself as the concerned family member, while I was cast as the struggling, overwhelmed caregiver who couldn't handle the responsibility she'd taken on. That night, after Grandma was asleep, I'd called Whitney in tears. She's trying to take Grandma away from me, I'd sobbed into the phone, sitting on the floor of my bedroom in the dark. She's convincing everyone I'm not capable, and I don't know how to fight back. Whitney had been furious on my behalf. That's manipulation, Rachel. Classic manipulation. She's not concerned about your grandmother. She wants that house and she's willing to destroy your reputation to get it. You need to protect yourself. Document everything you're doing. Keep receipts for every expense. Write down every medication, every doctor's appointment, every moment of care. Build your own case. I'd listened to her advice, knowing she was right, but feeling overwhelmed by yet another task added to my impossible list. December brought Grandma's 84th birthday, and I'd organized a small family gathering at the house despite my exhaustion. My parents had flown up from Arizona, and Kevin and Vanessa had come over with a store-bought cake and a card. We'd sung happy birthday around the dining room table while Grandma had smiled, though I wasn't sure she understood what was happening. She kept asking who all these people were, why they were in her house, and I'd explained over and over that they were her family celebrating her birthday. My father had looked uncomfortable, his eyes taking in the leak-stained ceiling in the dining room, and the slightly warped floorboards near the window. My mother had helped me in the kitchen, washing dishes while making small talk that felt forced and careful. Vanessa had cornered me near the end of the evening, her voice low so others wouldn't hear. I hope you're not mad about me calling your parents, she'd said, though her expression suggested she didn't care whether I was mad or not. I'm just worried about Grandma getting the care she deserves. And about you honestly. You look exhausted. This situation isn't good for anyone. I'd kept my face neutral, my voice calm. Grandma is getting excellent care. And I'm fine. Vanessa had smiled. A tight expression that didn't reach her eyes. If you say so. But I think we both know this can't continue indefinitely. Something's going to have to give. She'd walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing in the hallway with my heart pounding and my fists clenched at my sides. After everyone left, I'd helped Grandma change into her nightgown and tucked her into bed. She'd looked up at me with sudden clarity, her blue eyes sharp for the first time in days. "Rachel, sweetheart," she'd said, taking my hand. "I need to tell you something important. I've updated my will. Everything I have, the house, my jewelry, my savings, it's all going to you. I know your brother is doing well for himself, and you're the one who's been here, who's sacrificed everything to take care of me. I want you to have it. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't deserve it." I'd felt tears welling up, emotion clogging my throat. "Grandma, you don't have to worry about that right now." But she'd gripped my hand tighter, her strength surprising. "Yes, I do. I'm not going to be here much longer, and I need to know you'll be taken care of. Promise me you won't let them bully you out of what's rightfully yours." I'd promised, though I hadn't fully understood what she meant by them. And she'd drifted off to sleep looking peaceful for the first time in weeks. I hadn't told anyone about that conversation. Not my parents, not Kevin, certainly not Vanessa. It had felt private, sacred, a moment between Grandma and me that didn't concern anyone else. But looking back now, I wish I'd documented it somehow, written it down or recorded it, because that conversation would later become the center of a storm I never saw coming. Vanessa would claim it never happened, that I'd manipulated a confused elderly woman during a vulnerable moment. She'd paint me as a predator who'd taken advantage of dementia to secure an inheritance I didn't deserve. And when Grandma's will was eventually read, revealing that everything had indeed been left to me, Vanessa would launch an all-out war to prove I'd stolen what should have belonged to the family. But that December night, holding Grandma's hand as she slept peacefully, I'd simply felt grateful that she recognized my sacrifice and wanted to ensure I'd be okay after she was gone. I'd kissed her forehead, turned out the light, and gone to my own room, where I'd fallen into an exhausted sleep, not knowing that in less than 6 weeks, everything would explode in ways I couldn't possibly prepare for. The weeks following that birthday gathering felt like wading through quicksand, each day heavier than the last. January arrived with ice storms that knocked out power for 6 hours and left the streets treacherous. I'd spent that evening huddled with Grandma in the living room, wrapped in every blanket I could find, feeding her cold sandwiches by flashlight while she asked repeatedly when the lights would come back on. The furnace had stopped working without electricity, and the temperature inside the house had dropped to 50 degrees before the power finally flickered back to life near midnight. I'd cranked the heat up and stayed awake another 2 hours making sure the house warmed up properly, and that Grandma didn't develop hypothermia symptoms. My typical day started at 5:30 in the morning, when my phone alarm would drag me from whatever restless sleep I'd managed to achieve. I'd lie in bed for exactly 30 seconds, gathering the will to move, before forcing myself upright and stumbling down the hallway to check on Grandma. Most mornings she'd still be asleep, her breathing soft and even, her silver hair spread across the pillow. Those were the good mornings. Other mornings I'd find her already awake, sitting on the edge of her bed looking confused or agitated, sometimes having already removed her adult diaper, and made a mess I'd need to clean up before anything else could happen. On particularly bad mornings, she'd be standing in the middle of her room having already gotten partially dressed in mismatched clothes, insisting she had somewhere important to be. The morning routine had become a carefully choreographed dance I'd perfected through months of trial and error. First, help her to the bathroom and wait outside the door in case she needed assistance, listening carefully for any sounds of distress or falling. Then guide her to sit on the toilet while I ran warm water in the sink and prepared her washcloth, toothbrush, and hairbrush on the counter where she could see them. She could still manage some personal care tasks on her own if I set everything up and gave clear, simple instructions. "Brush your teeth now, Grandma. Here's your toothbrush. Good job. Now let's wash your face with this warm cloth." While she completed these tasks, I'd lay out her clothes for the day on her bed, always choosing soft, comfortable items with elastic waistbands and no complicated buttons or zippers that would frustrate her declining motor skills. Getting her dressed could take anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour depending on her level of cooperation. Some mornings she'd docilely allow me to help her into clean underwear, elastic waist pants, and a soft sweater without complaint. Other mornings she'd fight me on every item, insisting the clothes were wrong or dirty, or belonged to someone else. "Why are you trying to put me in strangers' clothes?" she'd demand, pushing my hands away with surprising strength for someone so frail. "These aren't mine. I want my own clothes." I'd learn not to argue with her delusions. Instead, I'd agree and distract. "You're absolutely right, Grandma. These aren't quite right. Let's try these other ones instead." Then I'd pull the exact same outfit from a different drawer, and she'd often accept them without question. The simple change of location satisfying whatever confused logic her brain was following. Once she was dressed, I'd guide her slowly down the stairs, my hand firmly gripping her elbow, both of us taking one step at a time. The staircase in that old Victorian house was steep and narrow, beautiful but treacherous, and I lived in constant fear of her tumbling down it. We'd make our way to the kitchen where I'd settle her at the table with a glass of orange juice while I prepared breakfast. Grandma had always been particular about her morning meal, and even with dementia, some preferences remained hardwired. She wanted oatmeal. Always oatmeal, cooked until it was very soft and served with exactly 1 tablespoon of honey and a handful of fresh or frozen blueberries. She'd watch me prepare it, sometimes making observations that were surprisingly lucid. "You're a good cook, Rachel," she'd say. "You learned from me, didn't you?" Other times she'd accuse me of being an intruder in her kitchen, demanding to know what I was doing with her food. Medication time was its own special challenge. Grandma took 7 different prescriptions, each with its own schedule and dietary requirements. 3 pills in the morning with food, 2 at midday, 3 more in the evening, plus 2 supplements her doctor had recommended. I'd tried every method to get her to take them willingly. I'd explained what each pill was for, used a pill organizer with clear labels, crushed them into applesauce when she refused to swallow them whole. Still, most mornings involved some level of resistance. "I don't need all these pills," she'd insist, pushing them away. "You're trying to drug me. I'm perfectly healthy." I'd learned to stay patient, to keep my voice gentle and calm even when I wanted to cry from frustration. "These are from your doctor, Grandma. They help your heart stay strong and keep you feeling good. Just take them with a few bites of oatmeal. Please." Sometimes it worked. Sometimes I ended up crushing them into her food without telling her, hating the deception but knowing it was necessary. By the time breakfast and medications were finished, it would be close to 7:30. If I was working that day, I'd need to leave by 7:45 to make it to Bridgetown Brew by 8. That meant settling Grandma in her armchair with the television remote, a cordless phone with my number on speed dial, and strict instructions not to try to cook anything or go outside. I'd double-check that the stove knobs were in the off position, that the front and back doors were locked with the high-security locks she couldn't reach, that there were no obvious hazards she might trip over. Then I'd kiss her forehead, promise I'd be back soon, and leave with my stomach in knots, knowing anything could happen while I was gone. The drive to work took 20 minutes if traffic was good, longer if the weather was bad, or there was construction on Hawthorne Boulevard. I'd park behind the cafe and enter through the back door, tying on my apron and forcing myself to shift mental gears from caregiver mode to customer service mode. The coffee shop opened at 8, and customers would already be waiting outside, eager for their morning caffeine fix. My coworker Jasmine would usually be there already, counting the register and setting up the pastry case. She was 22, fresh out of Portland State University with a degree in sociology and no clear career path, working at the cafe while she figured out her next move. She was sweet and hardworking, but she had the kind of problems that seemed trivial compared to mine. She'd complain about her roommate not doing dishes or her boyfriend forgetting their anniversary, and I'd nod sympathetically while thinking about Grandma potentially falling or getting confused or setting something on fire. The morning rush at Bridgetown Brew was relentless, a 4-hour marathon from 8 until noon with barely a moment to breathe. Customers would line up out the door, ordering complicated drinks with specific instructions. Extra hot soy latte with 2 pumps sugar-free vanilla and light foam. Grande Americano with room for cream, Make sure it's really hot. Venti iced caramel macchiato upside down with an extra shot and almond milk instead of 2%. I'd work the espresso machine while Jasmine handled the register, both of us moving in synchronized efficiency born from months of working together. My hands would cramp from tamping espresso grounds and steaming milk. My feet would ache in my required non-slip shoes. The constant noise of the grinder, the steam wand, the chatter of customers, and the overhead music would give me a headache that I'd ignore because there was no time to take ibuprofen. Some customers were kind, thanking me with genuine warmth, leaving tips in the jar by the register. Others were impatient and demanding, treating me like I was barely human, like I was a dispensing machine that existed only to fulfill their caffeine needs. There was a regular who came in every Tuesday and Thursday, a man in his 50s wearing expensive suits who never made eye contact, and always complained that his drink wasn't hot enough even when I'd practically scalded the milk. There was a woman who'd order a complicated drink, watch me make it, then claim I'd made it wrong and demand a remake even though I'd followed her instructions exactly. These people exhausted me more than the physical labor did. They reminded me that to most of the world, I was invisible, just another service worker not worth remembering or respecting. During the rare lulls between rushes, I'd check my phone obsessively, making sure Grandma hadn't called, that there were no emergency alerts or missed messages. I'd texted my neighbor Mrs. Helen Crawford, an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down, and asked her to keep an eye out. If you see anything strange at Grandma's house, please call me immediately, I told her. Mrs. Crawford had been wonderful, stopping by most mornings to wave at Grandma through the window and make sure she was okay. She'd call me once or twice a week with updates. I saw your grandmother sitting in her chair this morning. She waved at me. She seems fine. Those calls were small mercies that eased my constant anxiety. My shift would end at 1 in the afternoon, and I'd rush back to Laurelhurst without stopping, sometimes eating a protein bar in the car because I'd forgotten to pack lunch and didn't have time to buy anything. I'd burst through the front door with my heart pounding, immediately calling out for Grandma, and not relaxing until I saw her safe in her chair, or heard her voice responding from another room. Most days she'd be exactly where I'd left her, maybe having dozed off or still watching television. A few times I'd found problems. Once she'd tried to make tea, and left the electric kettle on with no water in it, filling the kitchen with acrid smoke. Another time she'd opened all the windows in January because she felt hot, leaving the house freezing, and the heating bill astronomical for that month. Afternoons were devoted entirely to Grandma's care, and the endless household tasks that never stayed done. I'd make us lunch, usually something simple like soup and sandwiches, and coax her into eating at least half of it. Then came the midday medications, another round of negotiation and gentle insistence. We'd spend time together in ways that felt meaningful despite her declining cognition. Sometimes I'd get out her photo albums and we'd look through decades of family pictures, me pointing at images and telling her stories about the people in them even when she couldn't remember their names. That's your sister Margaret at her wedding. Remember how it rained that day but everyone said it was good luck. That's your husband Thomas holding baby Kevin at the hospital. You told me once that Thomas cried when Kevin was born. Other afternoons I'd put on one of her favorite old movies, classics from the 1940s and 50s that she'd seen dozens of times. She couldn't follow new or complex plots anymore, but the familiar films seemed to comfort her. She'd watch Casablanca or Sing in the Rain with a slight smile, occasionally murmuring lines she'd memorized decades ago. During these quiet moments, I'd try to tackle household chores. I'd throw in loads of laundry, wash dishes, vacuum the living room, clean bathrooms, pay bills online, schedule doctor appointments, refill prescriptions, return phone calls from concerned relatives. The work was never-ending, a cycle that started over as soon as it finished. Twice a week I'd help Grandma take a shower, a process that required patience and careful supervision. She'd become modest and resistant to being naked in front of anyone, even me, and I'd have to convince her gently that she needed to stay clean and fresh. I'd warm up the bathroom with a space heater, lay out fresh towels and clothes, and help her undress while maintaining her dignity as much as possible. I'd installed a shower chair and handheld showerhead for safety, and I'd stay in the bathroom while she washed, ready to help if she became confused about what to do next. Sometimes she'd manage fine on her own with minimal guidance. Other times I'd have to help her soap up and rinse off while she protested or cried, embarrassed and frustrated by her dependence. Evening medication came at 6, followed by dinner preparation. Grandma's appetite had decreased significantly over the past months, and getting adequate nutrition into her was an ongoing challenge. I'd learned which foods she'd actually eat. Mashed potatoes with gravy, soft-cooked vegetables, chicken that was tender enough to chew easily, fruit smoothies I'd make in the blender. I avoided anything that required significant chewing, or might be a choking hazard. We'd eat together at the kitchen table, me encouraging her to take another bite, drink more water, try the green beans. After dinner I'd clean up the kitchen while she watched more television, then help her change into her nightgown and complete her bedtime routine. Getting Grandma to stay in bed through the night was perhaps the most exhausting challenge. Even with the extra locks on the doors and a baby monitor in her room, so I could hear if she got up, she'd often wander. I'd wake to the sound of her moving around, talking to people who weren't there, trying to get dressed for phantom appointments. I'd guide her back to bed repeatedly, sometimes 5 or 6 times in one night. My own sleep fractured into useless fragments that left me more exhausted than if I'd stayed awake entirely. The sleep deprivation was cumulative, building night after night until I felt like I was moving through fog, my thoughts slow and confused, my reactions delayed. My own life had become non-existent outside of caregiving and work. I hadn't seen Whitney in person for months, though we talked on the phone regularly. I'd stopped accepting invitations to anything social because I couldn't leave Grandma alone long enough to go out. My birthday had passed in November without acknowledgement, because I'd forgotten about it entirely until Whitney called to wish me happy birthday, and I'd realized with shock that I'd turned 28. I looked older than my age now. The stress had etched lines around my eyes and mouth. My hair was dull from cheap shampoo and lack of proper care. I wore the same rotation of 5 outfits, all chosen for comfort and practicality rather than style. I'd stopped wearing makeup because there was no point and no time. My financial situation had reached a crisis point. The $3,000 in savings I'd started with was gone, spent on medical supplies, medications, home modifications, and daily living expenses. My paychecks from Bridgetown Brew barely covered groceries and gas. The pet-sitting side gig had dried up because I couldn't commit to schedules anymore. I'd started putting expenses on a credit card, telling myself I'd pay it off later, watching the balance climb from $200 to $500 to over $1,000. The electricity bill had increased dramatically from running space heaters to keep Grandma warm. The water bill had tripled because I was doing 3 or 4 loads of laundry daily. Property taxes on the house were due, and I had no idea how I'd come up with the $4,000 required. Kevin had sent me $300 in December with a message saying this should help with expenses, but $300 was a drop in the bucket compared to what I actually needed. I'd thanked him because I couldn't afford to turn down any help, but I'd felt bitter resentment that he thought $300 was adequate contribution toward his grandmother's care. Vanessa was making good money in real estate, and Kevin's software engineering job paid well over 6 figures. They could have helped substantially if they'd wanted to, but they didn't want to. They wanted Grandma in a facility and the house sold, and they weren't going to enable what they saw as my stubborn insistence on an unsustainable arrangement. The isolation was crushing. I'd scroll through social media during rare breaks, seeing former friends posting about promotions and vacations and weddings and babies, living full lives while mine had shrunk to the dimensions of one Victorian house and the needs of one declining woman. I felt simultaneously resentful and guilty for feeling resentful. I'd chosen this. Nobody had forced me to become Grandma's caregiver. But I also felt trapped, unable to see any way forward that didn't involve either breaking my promise to her or completely destroying myself. Some nights after she was finally asleep, I'd sit in the dark in my bedroom and cry silently, pressing a pillow against my face to muffle the sound, mourning the life I wasn't living and feeling ashamed for mourning it. January 20th arrived with freezing rain that turned the streets into ice rinks and kept me home from work. I'd called Marcus apologetically, explaining I couldn't safely drive in these conditions, and he'd been understanding, but I could hear the frustration in his voice. "We're really short-staffed, Rachel. I know you've got a lot going on, but I need to be able to count on you." His words had stung because I knew he was right. I was unreliable. My caregiving responsibilities made me unreliable. I was becoming the employee who always had an excuse, always had a crisis, always needed accommodation. How long would Marcus's patience last before he decided hiring me had been a mistake? That afternoon, while freezing rain pelted the windows and Grandma napped in her chair, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and tried to figure out my finances. I created a spreadsheet listing every expense and every source of income, hoping the numbers would somehow add up to something manageable. They didn't. I was spending approximately $3,000 a month keeping Grandma at home and myself minimally functional. I was earning about $1,900 a month from the coffee shop. The math was brutally simple. I was going $1,300 deeper into debt every single month. At this rate, I'd be completely bankrupt within a year. My credit cards would max out. I'd default on the minimum payments. My credit score would tank. And then what? I'd lose my car, my phone, my ability to function at all. I closed my laptop and put my head down on my arms, feeling defeated in a way I'd never experienced before. This was unsustainable. Kevin and Vanessa had been right about that, at least. But the alternative, putting Grandma in a facility, felt like betrayal. She'd looked me in the eyes and asked me to let her stay home. She'd updated her will to leave everything to me specifically because I'd honored that promise. How could I break that promise now when she'd trusted me so completely? Yet how could I keep it when keeping it was literally destroying me? I sat there at that kitchen table feeling the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on my shoulders, knowing that something would have to give but having no idea what that something would be or when the final breaking point would come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.